All right, we're back on the record. The Town of Ocean City has concluded its cross-examination of the witness. I'll now ask if other parties present have any cross-examination of the witness. Hearing none, I will ask if any of the commissioners have questions of the witness.
Mr. Chairman,
Sorry, Commissioner O'Donnell.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions, Mr. Chairman. So thank you. Mr. Gravgard, can we go back to Exhibit 21 of Ocean City that you were discussing with council? Can you go back there with me?
I have it in front of me.
Thank you. So this started with a discussion about whether or not that layout, as kind of exhibited there, was perpendicular to the coastline or parallel to the coastline. But if you look at if you're talking about the Maryland coastline, 144th, 145th Street, it's neither parallel nor perpendicular to the Maryland viewshed, is it? Or coastline?
No.
More tangential?
No.
It's not tangential. Okay, how would you describe that view from northern Maryland to the proposed layout? Is it parallel, is it perpendicular, or is it somewhere in between?
It is somewhere in between.
Okay. But generally, those two rows of turbines, 6 each, going from west to east, that is generally perpendicular to the Delaware coast, is it not?
Correct.
And if you laid them out in those two parallel rows, north to south, at the easternmost edge of your area, if that was even possible, I don't know that it is. It would. You were saying that it would take up more of the viewshed or horizon view. Would that be from Maryland or Delaware or both?
It would definitely, from Delaware, it would be more. Now, I'm just drawing a sketching on top of this drawing here on my desk in front of me. It is a pretty close call.
Pretty close. Okay. So from Maryland, it would be pretty close. From Delaware, it would definitely be more of a viewshed impact, I think is what you're telling me. Let me ask you, the paragraph just above that visual there says that the project will be arranged in a grid pattern in the northeast corner of Skipjack's portion of the Delaware wind energy area, which is the area that's submitted for this project. If it's in the northeast corner, isn't that about as far away from the Maryland shoreline as you could get? In other words, if you go move turbines from the northeast corner to in a more southern posture, doesn't that get it closer to the Maryland shoreline?
I would say so.
All right. Okay, that's all there. I want to go back to the discussion of where these 12 megawatt turbines have been approved. Did you say New Jersey has approved them in your testimony?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and so without going to the specific reference in your testimony, what impact would it have if on the development of offshore wind on the East Coast from Skipjack's perspective If one of your projects had an 8 megawatt turbine and then the other project had a 12 megawatt turbine, what kind of impact might that have on supply chains and otherwise, in your opinion?
Right now, it would have an impact because we have procured turbine components to qualify for tax credits out of for the 12 megawatt turbine. So it would have an adverse impact on the project if that happened.
Might the
It would
supply
also,
chain,
sorry?
I was going to say, might the supply chains be more difficult to establish as we're establishing supply chains on the East Coast? One, and two, you were about to say something else. So answer my question, please, and add whatever else you would like.
So on supply chain, generally, we are procuring out of General Electric 92 plus 12 here if we get this approval. And if it gets reduced by something, then of course it means something to our supplier here, because it would also be the first project in the first commercial scale project in with this platform. So for them, it would have implications, yes, and also for us, because we would have to go over, renegotiate a turbine supply agreement, which is taking months almost, if not years.
Would it be fair to say that economies of scale are more likely if you can standardize your machinery?
Yes.
Fair enough. That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any additional questions from commissioners?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay. I just have one. Your testimony and my page numbers are all messed up, Mr. Gravgaard, but your testimony says that the 12 megawatt turbine is optimized for low wind conditions. Could you explain a little bit more about how it's different from the 8 megawatt unit and how it's optimized for low wind conditions?
Because it has a bigger rotor, and it means that in the lower wind speed area, it produces more energy. That is how it works.
Okay, simple as that. I thought maybe that was it, but I wasn't sure. And I guess then that this lease area is a low, what we call a low wind area.
I would not call it a low wind area. No, I would call this. It would be in the middle of the range. However, for everything that I can see, this turbine is more efficient.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gravgaard. This is Commissioner Linton. I'm not sure where I am on the screen, so I wanted to just let you know it was me. I had a couple of questions from your direct testimony. I'm on page 5, where you describe the Skipjack process for evaluating the 12 megawatt turbine. I noticed that in this description that you had here, you talked a lot about some of the mechanical and technical elements that the company looked at. Did you have people within the company at the time that you were considering moving to 12 megawatts? Do you have people also considering the viewshed concerns as well?
When we looked at this?
Yes.
Yeah, the concept and layout team have looked at that. Yes.
Okay, so you were looking at it at the same time. I know later on in your testimony, you talk about the impacts of the view shed. I think it's on page, your direct testimony on page 8.
Yes.
If so, I guess at the time that Skipjack was considering moving from 8 megawatt to 12 megawatts, you testified earlier today that this would be one of the first places that this particular turbine was going to be used.
That's correct. It's the first commercial scale project where this turbine is going to be used.
Okay, so the company is confident then that it's a better solution than the 8 megawatt one. We're not taking a risk by using a 12 as opposed to the 8.
We are, and I think particularly us that we are well suited to deal with this. Just if in my own history, I was the wind turbine project manager for a project called Westernmost Rough in the UK, which was the first commercial scale project with the Siemens 6 megawatt, which is the early version of the 8 megawatt, where we took part in exactly the same undertaking, bringing the first turbine out, yeah. And we brought that, and it is a highly reliable project today. And in addition, the MHI Vestas turbine, which we're using in the Irish Sea, and which is also being used in Germany, we did the same thing where we helped MHI Vestas to bring their product into commercial use. So we've done it a number of times before. Even before that, I think for an earlier generation of Siemens turbine, we have done the same. So we have a whole technical risk assessment department, which is looking at wind turbine technology and how it evolves, and evaluating new and coming turbine models at an early stage, so that we can be some of the early movers in using these.
Okay. On your one other question on your rebuttal testimony, also on page 5, where you talk about the deployment of the motion activated lighting.
Yes.
You testified earlier that that technology, you're waiting to see if that technology will be approved by federal regulators. How does the timing work on that? If for example, you've already begun the installation of the turbines, but you receive the approval after you've already installed turbines, can you then still install the commercial lighting? Is that still an option, or does it have to all be installed at the same time?
The way it works is you have radars installed in addition to the lighting. So some of the lighting is on the turbines is exactly the same. It is only the mechanism that switches them on, which is different, which is then activated through radars or other installations. It's an add-on to the project, and I'm certain that you can add that later on as well when it becomes available.
Okay, so I guess along those lines, if there are other, I don't know that there would be, but if there are other technical advancements in the future, they could also be, assuming they fit and work properly from an engineering perspective, they could be added on to this type of project?
Of course, it depends on what they are. If they change a blade completely, then you'd have to replace the blades. But add-ons, yes, and that happens.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
Mr. Karen, you're a witness for redirect.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Just have a couple of questions. Mr. Gravgaard, could you turn to your rebuttal testimony, sir. On page 4.
Yes.
I just want to ask a couple of follow-up questions in regards to some questions that Ocean City's council had asked you. And specifically on page 4, you were asked about the lease area for the Skipjack project.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure that we're clear. The lease area for the Skipjack project is in the lower quadrant of that section. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that is I guess I'll call it the darkly colored section of the lease, that lease area.
Yes.
And Skipjack did not determine that lease area, did it?
No.
That is
Yeah,
determined.
I'm sorry. Did not what that lease area? I'm sorry.
Did not determine.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
The lease area is defined by Bowen.
And that is defined through a stakeholder process, sir?
Yes.
And was this the lease area that Skipjack had rights to when it bid into the OREC bid in the Maryland auction?
Correct.
Your Honor, that's all I have.
Thank you. I did specify at the outset of this hearing that parties would be able to have any follow-up questions based on commissioner questioning. If there are questions based on responses to Commissioner O'Donnell, Linton's, or Herman's questions, parties may inquire at this time.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions.
Thank you. Hearing no additional questions, this witness is excused. Mr. Coran, just for processing, we'll plan to take a lunch at about 1 o'clock. Would you like to bring Mr. Perkins on now, or should we take the lunch break now?
I think we can bring him up now, Your Honor.
Okay, please call your next witness.
We're going to call Mr. Gordon Perkins to the witness stand. Mr. Gunderson will submit his testimony for the record.
Mr. Gunderson, there you are. Are you ready to proceed?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you.
You may proceed.
Skipjack calls Mr. Gordon Perkins to the witness stand.
Thank you. Please raise your right hand.
Sir, do you swear and affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in the matter now pending is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Perkins, can you please state your occupation and your title?
Yes, I'm a visualization specialist and a senior project manager at Environmental Design and Research.
And what is your current business address?
My current business address is 217 Montgomery Street, Syracuse, New York.
Thank you. Can you please briefly describe your educational background?
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from SUNY University, State University of New York, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. I have I've spent the last 20 years as a visual specialist for various companies. Most of them, most of the time that I've spent professionally has been here at EDR. I began working in the offshore wind industry in 2001 and worked on the Cape Wind project. And since then have worked on a number of both onshore, offshore wind proposals, creating visual simulations and visual impact assessments. I've done the same for natural gas and other fossil fuel traditional energy generation facilities since then.
Thank you. Do you have any professional certifications?
I'm a certified geographical information systems professional, and also a SUAS pilot on the FAA.
And about how many visual simulations have you completed over your 20 years?
Two. I can think of individual projects that exceeded 500 simulations, so I would say it would be to the tune of
Sorry, didn't hear that, sir. Tune of,
thousands of simulations.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of Mr. Perkins' background and experience, we are putting forth Mr. Perkins as an expert in the fields of visual simulations and visual impact assessments.
Mr. Chairman, I have some brief voir dire on the qualifications here.
You may proceed with voir dire, Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Perkins, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Perkins, looking at Ocean City Exhibit 20, is this a list of all the proceedings in which you have qualified as an expert?
Data request 1.5.
Data request 1.5.
To the best of my knowledge, this is a complete list. The only caveat, and this would be subject to check, I may have been entered into pre-file testimony for projects that I have sponsored. I'm unaware what stage some of those projects are in, so that's the only qualification, I believe.
All right. So in any of these proceedings, were you ever qualified as an expert on visual technology or visual simulation regarding offshore wind farms?
No, not in any of the proceedings that are mentioned in my test or in my response.
So in one of these proceedings, even those where you weren't qualified, involved 12 megawatt turbines. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And the only visual assessments that you've done for the 12 megawatts for 8 megawatts or the larger turbines was as a consultant for Ørsted, the parent of Skipjack. Isn't that correct?
No, so I have looked at the 12 megawatt turbine on several other, well, a few other projects, sorry.
You haven't been admitted as a witness on that, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And for the Ørsted project, you did visual simulations for the 12 megawatts for the South Fork wind farm, correct?
That is correct.
And that's the one where they're 30 and 35 miles off of Long Island, correct?
Correct.
So if you are to be qualified by the commission today as an expert, it would be the first time in any wind farm case anywhere where you have qualified as an expert. Is that correct?
I think the science of visual impact assessment does not rely on the size of the technology, and therefore my prior experience in visual impact assessment, I think qualifies me to assess any size technology in that respect.
Sir, that wasn't my question. Perhaps you misunderstood my question. So if you are qualified by the commission today as an expert, it would be the first time that you would ever have been qualified by anybody as an expert in a case involving wind farms. Isn't that correct?
In a case involving wind farms? No, that's not correct.
When else were you qualified as an expert by a court or regulatory body in a case involving offshore wind farms?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word offshore. You said wind farms previously.
I'm talking about offshore. We're here today for offshore wind farms, and I apologize if I didn't make that clear. This would be the first time, if the commission accepts you as an expert today, it would be the first time that you have ever qualified as an expert in a case involving offshore wind farms, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, I'll defer, the Ocean City will defer to the commission on this particular proffer.
Thank you, counsel. I recognize that the witness is not qualified as an expert witness for purposes of wind farms, either offshore or onshore at this point. Having reviewed his background and experience with visual simulations, I find that the witness is qualified to provide his opinion, and therefore we'll treat him as an expert witness. However, his testimony is going to be limited to that area and not beyond those competencies. Mr. Gunderson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Perkins, do you have before you a document that's been pre-marked as Skipjack Exhibit 4? Thank you. So Skipjack Exhibit 4 is titled The Direct Testimony of Gordon Perkins, dated April 17th, 2020, and consisting of 13 pages of testimony and 5 exhibits, along with an errata of that testimony that was filed with the commission on May 22nd, 2020, and identifies and makes corrections to Figure 2 on page 9 of your direct testimony and Exhibit GWP 5. Is that what you have before you?
Yes, it is.
And other than the corrections that were made to the direct testimony in the errata that was filed on May 22nd, do you have any other corrections to the direct testimony?
I do not.
And do you also have before you a document that has been pre-marked as Skipjack Exhibit 5, entitled The Rebuttal Testimony of Gordon Perkins, consisting of 14 pages of testimony and 4 exhibits? And other than, I'm sorry, do you have any corrections to the rebuttal testimony, Skipjack Exhibit 5?
On page 8 of my testimony, rebuttal testimony, sorry, line 19, and I'll give people a moment to get there. So, line 19, starting with daytime hours during a given year. Where it says 14%, I'd like to change that to 20%.
Mr. Perkins, can you speak up? You're changing 14% to what percent?
14% to 20%.
Thank you. If it is possible to bring your microphone a little closer, that would help with your audio. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. Were your direct and rebuttal testimonies prepared by you or under your supervision?
They were.
If I asked you the same questions today that are contained in your direct and rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same? Are your testimonies true and correct to the best of your information, knowledge, and belief?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we would respectfully move Skipjack Exhibits 4 and 5 into the record.
My dear, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Maloney.
All right, sir, looking at Exhibit 4 consists of your direct testimony as well as 5 exhibits. Exhibit G1, GWP1 is your CV, and GWP2 through 5, I'm looking at page 3 of your testimony, consists of daytime and nighttime visual simulations, panoramas of those simulations, and daytime visual simulations during overcast conditions, another one during peak beach occupation conditions, another one during two others during high visibility conditions. Is that correct? I'm just reading top of page 3.
Is correct.
And at the bottom of page 3, you said to show anticipated changes that there were high-resolution computer-enhanced image was used to create realistic photographic simulations of the project for the key observation points. And you talked about aligning the viewpoint through 3D camera, and then you walked through all the various in detail, how you use the AutoCAD and the data and everything else. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. And then you defend in the next 2 pages how the visual stimulations accurately reflect the project would be available from the shore, and talk about the guidelines for those projects. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then on page 7 and beginning of page 8, you describe how you created what the viewpoint was, the visual simulation, and how you created it and what you did. Is that correct?
Those pages describe the project details that we used.
Now, let's go to the exhibits themselves. With respect to the exhibits themselves, specifically, we're looking at exhibit GPW-2. That shows a daytime, says date taken November 7th, 2018. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And then we look at GPW GPW5, and that says it is taken on August 18th, 2018, correct? That's reported right there, correct?
That is, the date taken for that one is a representation. So we alter sun conditions in order to represent that time, correct?
Well, no, I want to ask you about that. Where you say right here on the photograph, it is August 18th, 2018. That's what you put here as date taken on the photograph. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, if we were to compare photograph GPW2 with photograph GPW5 First of all, let's look at the bottom third of the photograph, the sand there. The sand, it shows some tracks from, it looks like a beach vehicle that would have driven on there. It shows a curvature of that beach vehicle, both on GPW2 and GPW5. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So in other words, this is the sand, is the very same sand on both that was superimposed or photoshopped onto the bottom of this picture. Isn't that correct?
That's not correct.
Well, are you telling us that GPW2 and GPW5 represent the identical sand tracks from that motor vehicle that happened to look the curvature just the same on those 2 days?
No, I am not.
So they are the same, aren't they? The two curvature, it depicts the very same. In other words, those tracks in the sand didn't stay still from August of 2018 till November 2018, did they?
Those tracks are the same between the two photographs. That's correct.
They are. So in other words, the two tracks are the same on both photographs. They are taken on one day, but they are imposed on a photograph of a different day as well. Isn't that correct?
We did not place the tracks in the photograph.
Well, whether you place the tracks in the photograph or not, these are the very same tracks that were taken on a single day now appear or are represented to the commission as being taken on different days. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And do you have an explanation for the commission as to how the very same identical tracks that appeared there, every single bit, if you look closely with a magnifying glass, the same ones that appeared on August 18th, 2018, down to the tread of the photograph are identical in spacing, movement, and everything else on the November 17, 28 photograph. Do you have any explanation for how that is even possible?
Yes, as I explained in my testimony, the photograph taken for Exhibit 5 we built a 3D model of the existing environment, and we placed the sun in a position so that it would light the scene as that scene would appear on August 18th or August 18th, 2018.
Well, go ahead.
Essentially, we have replicated the lighting conditions for that date and time, assuming the weather conditions that are presented in the simulation.
So in other words, these are not actual conditions that were observed that day, but you are attempting to artificially impose through some graphic device what you think the sunlight might have been on a particular day. Is that correct?
It represents the azimuth and altitude and brightness of the sun on that particular day, done through a scientific methodology.
Well, when you say a scientific methodology, this is not an actual photograph. For instance, let's just focus on the sand for a minute. We'll get to the rest of the picture now. This is not an actual photograph of the sand as it existed either on November 7th, 2018 or August 18th, 2018. Isn't that correct?
Well, the sand as represented in GWP2 or GPW2, sorry, is an accurate representation of the time the photograph was taken.
All right, well, so the sand on November, so by definition then, the sand that is on November 7th, 2018 would not be an actual photograph of the sand as it existed that day. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
So that's some computer lab's idea of what it thinks the sand might look like on November 7, 2018. Isn't that correct?
It's a very likely accurate representation of what the lighting would be on that day.
Well, when you say likely, were you the individual who did this?
Yes.
All right. So in other words, what you thought you weren't there on the beach, nor was any photographer on November 7th, 2018, were you?
I was there on November 7th, 2018, yes.
But you didn't depict and take an actual photograph. Instead, what you chose to do was Photoshop the photograph from August 18th, 2018, and then impose upon that these shadows and sunlight to give what you think it might have looked like at that particular day. Isn't that right?
Objection, Your Honor.
Was a component of it, but I believe that's an oversimplification of the process.
Well,
Perkins, just a reminder again to the witness, if there's an objection by your attorney, please don't respond until the objection has been ruled upon. Mr. Maloney.
thank you. So this is just when you were in the photo lab, adjusting the lighting and adjusting the shadows and everything else. This was your vision of what do you think it looked like that day. Is that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. If this is voir dire, I think Mr. Perkins should be given an opportunity to explain how he created this photograph and the process that he went through, and that would provide the information that the commission needs to determine whether to admit this documented evidence.
No, I think that is fair, Mr. Maloney.
All right. Well, I mean, my problem is here is that it was represented to the commission that this, you look at it, photograph November 7, 2018, and you look at the photograph that's here, that is not November 7th, 2018. And that's not the only aspect of it. It's not just the sand. This infected the totality of the photograph when all of it or most of it was artificially created in a photo lab. And it has now been presented, at least to the naked eye, when you look at exhibit GPW2, as if this is a photograph that was taken on November 7th, 2018, when it is no such thing. It was artificially created in a lab.
Mr. Maloney, the witness has not had a response to respond to your characterization that it was artificially created. The commission has copies of all of these exhibits. They are clearly marked as simulations. I recognize the tire tracks are the same in GPW2, 4, 5. So it is the same sand, and I believe witness has acknowledged that. So,
well, I've just started the sand. It also extends to the ocean, the skyline, and everything else. It extends to the whole picture. Can I make a suggestion, Mr. Chairman?
you may.
I don't want to prolong this any longer. Perhaps the commission could conditionally admit his testimony subject to my objections after I've had a chance to, after he's had a chance, counsel can go through all in direct they want to say about this. And then I'll have a complete cross-examination. And then at that point, the commission can decide what to do with that.
I think that's a better way to proceed. You've already given a signal to Skipjack's counsel of where you're heading with some of this. So we could cease voir dire if there's no opposition, allow Mr. Gunderson to continue his direct, and then we'll expect you to pick this up on cross.
All right, and we preserved in the meantime all of our objections to the entire testimony in these exhibits in the meantime.
Your objection is noted for the record.
Thank you.
Mr. Gunderson.
And just as a point of clarification, Your Honor, does this apply to all of his testimony or just these the exhibits attached to his direct testimony?
Well, your Skipjack exhibit numbers 4 and 5. 4 includes not only his testimony, but exhibits 1 through 5, the simulations that we have received. And then his rebuttal testimony has attached to it 6 through 9. So are you moving collectively all of that into evidence?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Same objection.
Yeah. Objection is noted. Skipjack exhibits number 4 and 5 are marked and moved into evidence. Are you done, Mr. Gunderson?
I'm done with his admitting his testimony to evidence. I do have, there were a couple of points that Mr. Perkins wanted to address as to Mr. Sullivan's rebuttal testimony on rejoinder. If that's permissible, then we would proceed with that.
Why don't we continue with your direct now? It's approaching 1 o'clock. That might be a logical point to take a break, and then cross-examination can begin. So let's move forward.
Mr. Perkins, do you have in front of you a copy of the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Perkins?
Yes, which exhibit is that? Sorry.
It would be Ocean City Exhibit 9.
Yes, I have that in front of me.
And I believe at page 1, line 14 of his rebuttal testimony, Mr. Sullivan was asked to provide some observations concerning your direct testimony. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And how do you respond to Mr. Sullivan's claims, in which Mr. Sullivan claims that you have an over-reliance on visual simulations and it's not necessary to create visual simulations of the project in order to evaluate the project's visibility?
Yeah, I would respond to that. First of all, admittedly, visual simulations cannot produce or reproduce the dynamic environment presented in Ocean City or the dynamics of the human eye. Memory, peripheral vision, distraction, focus, and acuity are nearly impossible to replicate. However, just as a photograph of the Eiffel Tower does not bring you back to Paris, we still use photographs to document our experience. I think the concept put forth by Mr. Sullivan that simulations cannot portray the contrast presented by the project is contrary to a multitude of studies completed by professional landscape architects, engineers, and visual impact assessment specialists across the world. Mr. Sullivan, in his own publication titled A Guide to Evaluating Visual Impact Assessments for Renewable Energy Projects, states that simulations are an important component of VIAs for renewable energy projects, and their primary use is to help the impact analyst assess the visual contrast presented by the project. Simulations also help stakeholders and decision makers visualize projects and respond to development proposals. Visual assessment professionals have relied on simulations for decades. Additionally, photography and the resulting visual simulations offer the highest achievable possible resolution. It is my professional opinion that visual simulations are the best and most reliable method we have of illustrating a project in the planning stage. And I firmly believe that the exhibits presented in my testimony are an accurate representation of the visibility of the 8-megawatt turbine that the Commission reviewed in 2017 as compared to the current 12-megawatt turbine.
Thank you. And to follow up on some of the questions that you were just asked by Council for Ocean City, were the visual simulations that are attached to your direct testimony, were they produced by using industry standard practices?
Yes.
And can you explain to the Commission just briefly, because I know it's a very complex process, and it is covered in your direct testimony, but can you just explain to the Commission briefly that process and how you're able to produce the simulations that are attached to the direct testimony?
Yes, I think it's important to state up front. We completed the simulation for GWP presented in GWP2 and that was an actual photograph taken in the field. It's very important to include that as photograph condition in the simulation set.
Sir, you're breaking up. You're breaking up. Sorry. It's
Sorry.
very important to include. Yeah.
So it's very important to include that as shot condition in the simulations as I presented in my testimony. Exhibit GWP5 uses state-of-the-art visual simulation technology to simulate a crowd of people on the beach, just the same way that it presents the turbines on the horizon. These are three-dimensional depictions of beachgoers, and they are true and accurate in terms of scale, shading, color contrast, and typical beach activity during the time of day simulated in the photograph. I think it's important to note that Mr. Sullivan opines on the fact that other scenarios exist in which the turbines would be more visible. And on that point, I couldn't agree more. Whether the 8 megawatt or the 12 megawatt turbines are depicted in the visual simulations, there will be times when the turbines are clearly visible on the horizon, as demonstrated in exhibits GWP2 and GWP3. There will also be times when the turbines, both the 8 and the 12, will be minimally visible, as depicted in exhibit GWP5. Additionally, both the 8 and 12 megawatt turbines will be completely obscured from the viewer under certain atmospheric conditions. The purpose of visual simulations is to provide an accurate depiction of project character under a range of conditions.
Mr. Gunderson, you're on mute.
Thank you. Do the visual simulations included with your direct testimony use the same exact lighting, weather, and atmospheric conditions for both the 8 megawatt layout simulations and the 12 megawatt layout simulations?
Yes, they do, and with caveat there, we produced the 8 and 12 simulations of the 8 and 12 megawatt turbines in exhibit GWP2, and I think that's the only one. I'm sorry, and GWP3. The exact same parameters and lighting conditions were used for both the 8 and the 12 megawatt.
Mr. Perkins, can you suspend your testimony for a second? Madam Court Reporter, did you need us to stop the proceeding? We're off the record for a moment. Technical difficulties.
Hi, can you unlock the meeting room so we're able to dial back in?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Okay.
I couldn't hear you for the past couple minutes.
Oh, okay.
He talked about times when the turbines, both the 8 and 12, will be minimally visible as depicted on exhibit GWP5, and then I lost the audio.
Okay.
That was a good bit of stuff too.
Madam Court Reporter, we saw you. You never left us, but apparently there's an audio connection on your end there. How best to handle this? Do you want the attorney to ask his question again, or can we pull some of this from the live feed?
I won't have a live feed because I had no audio.
Sorry, I meant the live feed on YouTube.
If that's possible, I don't know.
because this proceeding is currently being live streamed as well with audio. Maybe Mr. Gunderson, if you could ask your last question over again, is that possible? I know Mr. Perkins was halfway through his response.
Yes, I think I could ask a follow-up question to get that testimony in.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Perkins, you were talking about the fact that the simulations that are comparing the 8 megawatt layout and the 12 megawatt layout use the same atmospheric conditions. And did you have some additional information you wanted to share with the commission regarding the visibility of the two layouts?
I think I can make this much shorter the second time around. The comparison simulations in Exhibit GPW2 and GPW3, the exact same parameters, including lighting and atmospheric conditions, were used for both the 8 megawatt turbine and the 12 megawatt turbine.
Thank you. And Mr. Perkins, one last question. Do you recall whether Mr. Sullivan confirmed in response to a discovery request issued by Skipjack that the methods that you employed to create the visual simulations in this case were in accordance with accepted techniques and common use?
I would just need to verify that. I do recall that.
Do you have Skipjack Exhibit 9 in front of you?
Yes.
If you turn to page 7 of Skipjack Exhibit 9, there's a response to Skipjack data request 1-94. You just read that to yourself and see if that refreshes your recollection.
I'm sorry, it was on page 7, you said?
Yes, page 7 of Skipjack Exhibit 9. Does that refresh your memory whether Mr. Sullivan stated in response to a discovery request in this case that the methods that you employed to create the visual simulations that you presented to the commission are in accordance with accepted techniques and common use?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Your Honor, I think that's all we have with Mr. Perkins on direct. He's now available for cross-examination.
Thank you. At this time, we will take a recess. We'll start back up at 1:45 p.m. Eastern, and we'll begin with cross-examination of this witness by Town of Ocean City, Maryland.
Thank you.
We're off the record.
Hey, Linda, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think your mic is still on, just FYI.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Sure thing. And also, I was trying to give you a call, so I'll try you again in a little bit.
Oh, okay, you can call me right now. I had my phone, muted, so.
Okay.
Call me now.
You might want to mute your feed, then I'll give you a call.
Okay.
Thanks.
My audio just cut right out. How do you mute? He's gonna get. Hello? Yeah, he's muted it now.
We'll get started in another 30 seconds. Okay, welcome back. We are back on the record in case number 9629. We left off with cross-examination beginning of Mr. Perkins. Mr. Maloney, are you prepared to proceed?
Your Honor, thank you. So, Mr. Perkins, good afternoon. Let's begin where Skipjack's counsel left off. And he was asking you whether Mr. Sullivan said you did this the right way. And you answered yes. Actually, his response was a lot more detailed than that, wasn't it?
Can you direct me to that section of his testimony, please?
I will. We're talking about page 4 of his testimony. Skipjack Exhibit 9.
Data response 190.
Data response 194, 1-94.
That was the very last exhibit we were looking at.
Correct.
Sorry, what was the exhibit again? For some reason, I'm not coordinated here with the
Skipjack Exhibit 9.
Skipjack exhibit.
What page on it?
Page 7.
Page 7 of the exhibit. Top of the exhibit.
Okay, my exhibit starts. Oh, I see the page numbers up top. Sorry. Page 7. Okay.
You see where he starts without more detail?
Yes.
All right, so what he really says is, without more detail, Mr. Sullivan cannot say for certain that the simulations were created using an appropriate methodology. However, the general descriptions of the methods employed by Mr. Perkins in his testimony is in accordance with accepted techniques in common use. That's what he actually said, isn't that right?
That's correct.
All right. So let's talk about the actual methodology that was used there. First of all, we're talking about recreating the appearance of something that doesn't exist yet, the wind turbines, correct?
That's correct.
So in other words, to the extent that you're trying to depict something that doesn't exist, and we don't know where, when, and exactly how it's going to exist, that it's certainly appropriate to use a simulation to try to depict where it is, correct?
The simulation illustrates the visual character, not necessarily where it is geographically.
Well, how the visual character will be driven by geographically where it is and how big it is and all that. We can agree on that. That's obvious, right?
That's correct, yes.
All right. And since you can't take an actual photograph of something that doesn't exist yet, the wind turbine, then it's appropriate to recreate the turbine itself, correct?
That's correct.
But let's now look at the exhibits so that we can be clear and so that the commission understands on each of these exhibits how much besides the wind turbines themselves are products of an actual photograph taken which depicts the scene as opposed to something that was created using computer graphics and the graphic artist's depiction of what he thinks the scene might look like, okay? I want to make sure that the commission understands how much of this is a real photograph and how much of it is simply the graphic artist's depiction of what the circumstances might look like. First of all, on what day, because we heard a couple different versions, on what day was the actual photograph taken? Was it November the 7th of 2018, or was it August the 18th of 2018?
The photographic presented in Exhibit GPW2 was taken November 7th, 2018 at 4 p.m.
Okay. So when we go back to GPW 5, which is the August 18th, 2018, that photograph was not taken on that day, correct?
That is correct.
And how about GPW 4, which depicts to be March 28th, 2018, that photograph was not taken on March 28th, 2018. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. So when we're looking at November 7th so when we're looking at August, the August photograph, that is the actual photograph of the sand as it existed that day. Is that correct?
No, as I mentioned previously, the photograph presented in GWP5 was actually taken. It was physically photographed in November of 2018.
So when the actual tire tracks were there, and that's helpful, when the actual tire tracks were there, the actual tire tracks were there in November, and that photograph was taken there in November of 2018, correct?
Correct.
So let's go, and how about the actual ocean, the waves that are seen there and everything? When was that? Was that an actual photograph from November 7th of 2018?
The waves represented in GWP, or GPW, sorry, 5 are the same waves represented in a photograph taken in November.
All right, so I want to know the real photograph, not the graphic artist's depiction of it or creation of it. The real photographs of the waves we're looking at, actually, those waves actually took place in that configuration on November 7th, 2018. Is that correct? GPW2. That's a real photograph of that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And how about the sky here itself? The clouds, the overcast nature of it, slightly overcast. Was that actually taken from a photograph of November 17th, 2018, or was it created or touched up somewhere?
I'm sorry, are you referring to Exhibit GPW2?
Correct.
The sky is the actual conditions photographed in the field.
And the same would be of shadows that were there on the sand that day. Those are actual shadows that were photographed, correct?
That is correct.
Now, let's go to August 18th, 2018, which would be GPW, looks like 5, is that it? 4, page 2. You're looking at August 18th, 2018, correct? Do you see that?
Yes.
First of all, you've told us that's not the sand from that day. That was photoshopped, or whatever technical term we want to use, onto the picture, correct?
Yeah, I would refrain from photoshopped. It's actually 3D modeled in the scene.
All right, you can say 3D model, I'll say Photoshop because I'm not an expert. And then we look at the ocean, the waves here, and the actual crest of the waves. Those are the waves taken from, and the whole ocean picture is taken from the November 7th, 2018 picture, correct?
Correct. I would like to add to that, though. When we 3D model this scene, we also put a representative model to understand how the lighting would appear at a particular time that we're representing.
If you look at the crest of the waves and everything else, that's actually the exact crest and the exact depiction of the waves from November, but they're sort of 3D Photoshop or 3D modeled, whatever we want to call it, onto the ocean, onto this picture, correct?
Correct.
And how about the sky itself? Where did the sky itself come from for the August the 8th, 2018 picture?
The sky would have been taken from a different location under variable conditions. It's likely from the study area, but I can't confirm that at this time.
So the sky could have come from anywhere. Could have come from Florida or New York, you don't know actually where the sky came from, correct?
It's extremely unlikely that it came from Florida because I've never, the sky is either from the Skipjack site or from the Delaware shoreline.
Well, sitting here today, you don't actually know or have any specific recollection of where the sky came from, correct?
Well, we always draw from a library of skies that are taken over the ocean at specific times, and that library is quite large. But the most likely scenario, either the Delaware or the Maryland shoreline.
All right, but you don't know for sure where the sky came from, other than it came from your sky library. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you had a whole range of pictures in the sky library to choose from that could look at any different range of things. Is that right?
We do have a range of skies, yes, and it's driven by the 3D model based on the time of day and the conditions present.
All the people on the beach with the umbrellas and the beach outfits and everything, who are not socially distancing here, where did they come from?
They come from a library of people that we use frequently in scenes to create representations of the population.
And you have no idea where these people are, whether they're from California, New York, Florida, Delaware. You have no idea who these people are, where they're from, right?
That's correct.
And how about all these boats out in the ocean? Do you have any idea where they are too?
Those are representations taken from our library as well.
All right. So when we're looking at August 18th, 2018, the truth is, although this says August 18th of 2018, nothing on this picture is actually from August, it has an actual photograph from August 18th, 2018. Isn't that correct?
Well, I would like to direct you to my direct testimony. Let me just find the page number here. Page 11, line 3 of my direct testimony.
Yes.
In there, I say, additionally, Exhibit GWP5, a visual simulation of the project, was created to illustrate hazy summer conditions with an increased level of activity on the beach and in the ocean. He noted that both of these conditions were simulated, and while representative of the intended condition, are not actual photo condition. And then I go on to explain how those individuals were placed on the beach.
All right, but when it says August 18th, 2018, nothing, not a bit of it is from August 18th, 2018. Correct?
Well, as I stated in my direct testimony, it's representative, and the lighting that appears on the umbrellas, the lighting on the ocean, the sky condition is all representative based on what we call an atmospheric system and daylight system that we use in the 3D model to predict conditions like this.
Were you on the beach there, Maryland or Delaware Beach, on August the 18th of 2018?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to.
Well, were you don't know whether or not you were present and got a chance to see what the actual conditions were on August 18th, 2018 before you recreated them in a photo lab?
So we didn't in a photo lab again. I think it downplays the amount of thought that goes into the visual simulation process. However, if I was in Ocean City on that day or on the Delaware beaches, and at this time I'm not entirely sure if I was there, I did not photograph this condition at this time.
All right, and you have no idea whether August 18th, 2018 was a cloudy day, a sunny day, or a rainy day, or anything else, is that right?
That
If I were to pull up the weather reports from that day, you don't know what it was like that day, correct?
Yeah, I think it's likely that we did pull the weather reports because we do report temperature and humidity on that particular day.
All right. The fact is that you simply, because you have graphic 3D skills, created in your mind and on this photograph what you think the beach would have looked like on August 18th, 2018, without ever taking a photograph there, being present there, or really knowing exactly what it does look like. You just out of whole cloth created your visual image of what things would look like at August 18th, 2018. Isn't that correct?
As I stated before, there are model parameters that we entered into this to reasonably predict a condition that could occur during this time of day on this date, and future days for that matter. And I think it's not just my opinion that it's a reasonable representation. I think anyone looking at this could surmise that this condition can occur on Ocean City Beach.
Well, it could occur at any beach in the world, maybe. But the question is whether it is a fair and accurate depiction of what a particular beach would look like on a particular time in August. And when you say you inputted parameters, I mean, what data did you have from actual observations from the beach that was inputted to lead to this for this particular beach at this particular location?
Yes. So first of all, we have the base photograph in November. Secondly, again, we created a 3D model that uses a predictive system to predict the lighting that would reasonably occur on that particular day under conditions. And we placed 3D models of individual. These are survey accurate simulations. So the 3D models of the people shown in here are accurate to scale, and the lighting that they cast is also accurate. Sorry, the shadows that they cast. The sky is a reasonable prediction of a sky that would likely and probably regularly occur at Ocean City. And therefore, the entire composed image, which is a perfectly reasonable method of relaying relaying illustrations of a project, it's perfectly reasonable practice as long as, and this is the only qualifier, you have to show in the as shot condition as well. And so I think the point is, I'm trying to relay to the commission the concept that summer haze and fog will diminish the visibility of the project. We're not saying that the project will not be visible. That is not the intent of this simulation, purely because we show the project plainly visible in the other simulations. I think as an accompaniment to that clear weather condition that we provided, this is a perfectly reasonable representation of the project.
Well, you're basing that based on things that you have no idea because you haven't been to the beach on these times. You didn't take photographs there. You don't have data of what the beach was like there. And you really don't know what these images are going to look like from the beach, therefore. So you're basically putting, for lack of a better word, your artist's conception of what you think it might look like. Isn't that true?
No, I would say that artist conception is absolutely not true. Because we're inputting scientific data into the simulation, there's very little latitude in the parameters that we choose. And therefore, as I stated in my direct testimony, it's a reasonable representation.
Well, depending upon the imposition of lighting or so-called haze factor or where you located this or what time of day you located this, you would show greater or even or lesser degrees of visibility for the turbines. Isn't that correct?
As I mentioned before, the important thing here is when you represent conditions like this, you always accompany it with the as-shot condition, which is what we've done.
Well, the as-shot condition you accompanied with was from November and not from a sunny day in August. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So it may look one thing in November and another thing in August. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And what time of day does this supposedly depict?
11:54 a.m.
And it's true, is it not, that you didn't take any photographs or even attempt any depictions of time that would involve the famous Ocean City sunrise? Isn't that correct?
I'm sorry, the Ocean City
Sunrise. When the sun goes up, one of the important parts of the iconic viewscape here, the sunrise. Went up this morning at 5:34 a.m. It was gorgeous. Did you make any depictions of what the wind turbines would look like at the sunrise?
We did not.
And look, showing you exhibit GPW4, I don't want to spend the same amount of time going through this photograph, but this supposedly depicts March 28, 2018 at 2:54 p.m. in the afternoon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, just to be sure, you weren't on the beach that day and didn't take any photographs of that day. Is that correct?
I did not take this photograph on that day.
You didn't take any other photographs as far as you know that day. You weren't even there, correct?
I'm afraid I spent a lot of time taking photographs of the city, so I would qualify that with subject to check. I don't believe I was there on that day.
All right. And if we look at the photograph, you've got those tire tracks from November there, right? You 3D that onto there, correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
You've got those tire tracks that were 3D'd or photoshopped from the November photograph, right?
No, we use the November photograph as a base, and so we didn't photo anything.
Sure you did. Look at them. They're the very same tire tracks that we see on the August photograph and the November photograph. Down to the tread. It's identical, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Yes. So the November photograph was based to create this photograph, hence the reason the tire tracks are exactly the same.
And not only we photographed we photoshopped the ocean with the identical crest of the waves. Those are taken from the November photograph, correct?
So I'll state it again, because what you're saying are two different things, and so I disagree with your statement. They are the same, but this photograph was used as a base. The photograph taken in November was used as a base in the creation of this photograph.
When you say base, what happens is you Photoshop the ocean with the waves, and then you also Photoshop the skyline, and then you adjust it accordingly, right?
I'm sorry, no, that's not what we do.
Well, when you say you take it as a base, you then put in what you think the appropriate data would be as to how much haze or how dark a day or how bright a day or how much overcast it was. You look at all of those factors to try to take the base photograph of November and depict how it would be in March. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, yes. I guess I could have explained it much more easily by saying it's an additive process rather than a subtractive process.
And when it's an additive process, you're adding your views or the views of the data that you think is relevant as to what haze might be there, what overcast, what darkness and everything else to get what you think might look like. Isn't that correct?
It predicts the predictive model that we use and the parameters that are set in the model, such as the time of day and the angle. Well, the time of day pushes or drives the angle of the sun, the atmospheric conditions, the azimuth and altitude of the sun. So those parameters are input.
You're breaking off again, sir. Sorry, you're breaking off again. Atmospheric.
So the atmospheric model that we use is the model that allows us to represent the conditions presented in the simulation.
And so let's get to this atmospheric model and the predictive data that's added. Are you the person who puts together this additive model that causes the sky to be dark or light or overcast or rainy or not? Or do you get that from some third party?
No, we do that ourselves. And I oversaw the model inputs that were used for the simulation.
So, so you could predict, you would say, we're going to make this 60% hazy on this day because 60% of the days have been hazy and 40% on another day. Is that correct?
The predictive model just represents and I don't typically, we do look at the frequency of each condition, but or just to represent regular reoccurring overcast conditions.
And is it true that you only pick 3 or 4 visual simulations, the ones we have here in evidence, from the tens of thousands of possible visual presentations of the iconic shoreline that occur all year round? Is that correct?
We wanted to, that is correct. The intention was to present 3 separate visibility scenarios to the commission, one being a high visibility, and then the other 2 presenting conditions under which visibility would be reduced.
And you do work for Ørsted. Have you ever done any work for any entity that opposes wind turbines or seeks their relocation? And who'd you do work for then?
It's a project. We have worked for a number.
It's a what?
I'm sorry. So the work that I have to think back in my memory stores here, but the one that comes to mind immediately is a private client that we worked for in Maine, where we presented graphic report their position on wind power, and then we've worked for. Trying to think of other examples.
Now, you are familiar with the study entitled Offshore Wind Turbine Visibility and Visual Impact Threshold Distances, aren't you?
Yes.
And that is one of the seminal works in the field, isn't it?
I don't know that I would call it a seminal work in the field. It's certainly a useful resource that we often reference.
Well, yeah, you have considered it authoritative enough that you frequently rely on it in your reports and studies on visual impact assessments. Isn't that right?
We typically don't rely on any one resource, but yes, we often use it as evidence, the potential visibility thresholds.
Most of your papers cite it because it's authoritative. Isn't that correct?
Our papers cite it as supporting evidence when we're establishing visual study areas for projects.
And you know that it's authoritative because if it wasn't, you wouldn't rely on it, correct?
What exactly do you mean by authoritative?
Authoritative means generally accepted in the field.
Yes.
And one of the authors of that study is Robert Sullivan, the expert for the town of Ocean City. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And you know Mr. Sullivan to be one of the leading experts in the field. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And because you have cited that study so often, you are aware of its finding that said that wind turbines were noticeable to casual observers at distances of 18 miles and were visible with extended and concentrated viewing at distances beyond 25 miles. You're aware of that, aren't you?
I am aware of that.
And in fact, you agree with it because you cited this in the visual impact assessment for Southwind Fork Farm, the Orsted project that is advertised as not being visible because it's 30 and 35 miles from the shoreline. Isn't that correct?
Well, I think your description of South Fork Wind Farm is a misrepresentation of its distance from shore, because in fact it's very much closer to the shore than that.
Well, in fact, there are portions of the Southwind Fork Wind Farm that are 30 and 35 miles distant from Long Island, and it's been written up as such in Orsted's publications. Isn't that correct?
I have not seen those publications from Orsted, but I believe if we're speaking about Montauk, then yes, that is true.
In fact, Orsted writes that up as not being visible at all from the shoreline. They advertise that as such, as opposed to this one where they concede it is visible. Isn't that correct?
I'm afraid I can't speak to Orsted's advertisement, as I have not seen those.
And you would agree that offshore wind turbines assessed in that study you rely on were all 5 megawatts or less, and thus much smaller than the 12 megawatt turbines we're talking about now. Isn't that correct?
I'm sorry, which study are you referring to?
I'm referring to the one I quoted you a minute ago, offshore wind turbine visibility, the one that you cite frequently.
That's what I'm led to believe, yes, that the turbines were 5 megawatts and below.
So if anything, they understated the visibility for these turbines because they're more than double the size of the 5 megawatts. Isn't that true?
Well, I would suggest that the 12 megawatt turbine, although it's than your typical 5 megawatt turbine, I think that visual acuity still comes into play when you're viewing turbines at such a distance. And frankly, 22 miles is actually a very long distance over water. And so while the height of the turbine is quite a bit taller, the individual components, it doesn't necessarily subject the viewer to additional visibility that would be, I think particularly given their position offshore, there's really no scale elements to compare them to. But the individual components of the turbine, the visibility of those comes down to visual acuity. And I think reasonably similar.
Well, with respect to visual acuity, first of all, we can't recreate what the human eye sees on paper or photographs or even in your graphics. Isn't that correct?
Acuity is very, very difficult to well, it's impossible to illustrate in a simulation. However, there is mathematical science behind the resolution of the human eye. And when you're purely talking from a dimensional standpoint, visual acuity related on different dimensions of objects offshore.
I'm not sure what you just said, but I think you agree with my premise that visual acuity can't be recreated on paper or in photographs or in your graphics. It's very difficult to recreate, correct?
Well, again, in case you didn't hear my last answer, but visual acuity can actually be solved as a mathematical equation based on the resolution of the human eye. And so some assumptions can be made on what types of objects can be seen and how far they can be seen in a theoretical sense.
The reality is, in your field, it is well established and well published that visual acuity is so complex in a human that it cannot be recreated in photographs or graphics accurately, completely accurately. Isn't that true?
In photographs and graphics, but it can be computed mathematically.
All right, I'm talking about photographs and graphics like the ones you have here. It's true that does not even purport to recreate the visual acuity of a human observer on the beach or in a condominium, because in your field in science, as you've just admitted, you cannot recreate visual acuity in graphics or photographs, correct?
Well, I think I really disagree with that statement, because if you can see an object, you are proving that the human does have the visual acuity to see it. If it's shown, then you're demonstrating some aspect of visual acuity.
No, you misunderstand my question, or at least purport to. My question was, it's impossible, is it not, to recreate the complexity of human visual acuity in a photograph and graphics. That's a principle well established in your field. Isn't that correct? Unless you're taking a minority view on that.
No, I mean, I think I must be taking a minority view. I think what you're missing in a simulation is the fact that it's a dynamic scene. But acuity in and of itself, if you can see something, then you have the acuity to see it by definition. So
well,
I believe that acuity is able to we're able to demonstrate it in simulations.
I think we're semantical here, and let's move away from that. The graphics represent an attempt to recreate human acuity, but we cannot with complete thoroughness recreate, as Mr. Sullivan will explain later today, if you won't, can recreate the entire complexity of human acuity. That's not a principle you disagree with, isn't that correct?
Objection has been answered.
Objection is sustained.
And you mentioned dynamics. With respect to dynamics, none of your recreations attempted to recreate the dynamic of a spinning wind turbine, of the blades, the large 360-foot blades spinning, did they?
We so the concept, and I'll just take a minute to explain why motion is an important factor here. The motion of the turbine blades could potentially attract a viewer's attention on the beach. However, the simulations that we have provided, particularly those presented in Exhibit GPW2, they present the turbines in a very narrow field of view, about 40 degrees. So there's no need to attract the viewer's attention in those situations because you're staring straight at the turbines. So we didn't feel, for the purposes of this comparative exercise between the 8 and the 12 megawatt turbine, that it was necessary to show motion.
So the answer to my question is no, you made the decision not to depict blade motion, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And with respect to the conditions under which you chose to depict here, do you agree with the proposition that simulations that are lower in contrast than they would be that the changing contrast of simulations affects visibility? In other words, there's a marked difference between lighter days and darker days, between good visibility and low visibility. You agree with that common sense proposition, don't you? And you also agree that the printed simulations do not have the dynamic range of the human eye to show the full range of contrast that is visible to human beings in the real environment. You agree with that, don't you?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
You agree that the printed simulations that you've offered the commission do not have the dynamic range of the human eye to show the full range of contrast that would be available to a human in a real environment. You agree with that, don't you?
I do agree.
Now, you agree apparently that under certain conditions, the Skipjack project would be visible from Ocean City at 19.5 miles at the 8 megawatt, even the 8 megawatts as set forth in 2016. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And you also agree that 15 8 megawatt turbines at 19.5 miles would be visible to someone scanning the horizon without having to look closely for the wind turbines for an extended period of time. Isn't that correct?
Under clear conditions, I agree.
And you also agree the same with 12 megawatt turbines at 21.5 miles an hour, that they would be clearly visible to someone scanning the horizon without them having to look closely for it at an extended period of time. Isn't that correct?
I would qualify under clear conditions, yes.
All right. And you, with respect to the simulations that you did prepare, were you ever asked to show these simulations to the town of Ocean City?
That would not be in the purview of my work. I provide the simulations to the client, and that's the.
My question is, after you did that, did they say, we'd like you to go show these to the town of Ocean City, their reaction to that? Did you ever do that?
I would not be in a position to do that. I'm not permitted to just share simulations with whomever I.
Well, my question is, did they ask you to do that? And the answer is no, right?
They did not ask me to do that.
Did they ever ask you to look at any alternative scenarios except the particular site that you were given?
Honestly, I can't recall at this time. I believe we chose the view that we did because it was the closest view to Ocean City.
All right, but my question, that's the view from 144th Street, correct?
That is correct.
But my question is a different one. Were you ever asked to take the view from 144th Street and look at any alternative layouts, either in locations of the wind turbines, or were you simply told by Skipjack that these are the ones and the only ones you should, only one location you should consider?
We've considered a lot of routes in the past. So I, for the purposes of this exercise, I was asked to compare a 8 megawatt layout and a 12 megawatt layout, as shown in the and in my testimony.
Well, have you been asked to consider any other layouts other than these since May 17th of 2017?
Yes, and I believe the other layouts that we've investigated are subject to confidentiality under the top.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that it be closed. I'd like to hear about this and what the commercially reasonable efforts were to look at other layouts, the best commercially reasonable efforts. And I'd ask that at this time we sequester the hearing to protect confidentiality.
Counsel for Skipjack, do you have a response?
I think what Mr. Perkins was referring to was the COP that's been filed with BOEM. So to the extent that counsel wants to question Mr. Perkins on the contents of that document, then I agree that's confidential.
Mr. Maloney, what is this visual expert witness going to provide with respect to information contained within the plan?
Commission on May 17th, 2017 ordered that as they go forward, that they use their best commercially reasonable efforts to find sites that would minimize the visual impact to Ocean City. Obviously, one of the very first things they would do is use this expert, who is their visual expert, to look at alternative sites to see whether or not those sites would minimize the visual impact. So he would be the guy to do it. This would be the order of the commission to do it. And now the question is, what other sites did he look at that were, as the commission ordered, and were they commercially reasonable? He can't say whether they're commercially reasonable, but what he can show is these are the other sites that Skipjack had me examine to determine their visual impact on Ocean City. One half of that very important equation, the equation that the commission said in May of 2017 would be a threshold issue.
And have we determined that the witness has stated that he has examined other potential sites?
He just said he did, but he said that he thought it was confidential and he didn't want to testify in front of the public.
Well, Your Honor, I think there may be some confusion here. I think he was talking about different layouts, but not different sites. But secondarily, I don't see how this is relevant to the change in turbine from 8 megawatt to 12 megawatt. Mr. Perkins is here to testify as to visual simulations that he performed on the current layout as compared to the layout that the commission reviewed in 2017, and going outside of that with additional layouts that may or may not have been considered is just, it's not relevant for the purposes of this hearing.
May I be heard?
You may.
On May 17th of 2017, the commission issued an order for 6 and 8 megawatts that were supposed to be in a certain location. Since then, as the commission has already been determined, there has been a material change in the project, particularly in the size. We're now talking about 12 megawatts, and now the presentation, a major change in the location, the layout. As part of the commission's May 7, 2017 order, it ordered the applicant to use all best commercial reasonable efforts to minimize the impact on the view shed of any location that we have here. So the question is, with this material change here, what best commercial efforts were utilized to comply with that language in the commission's order to minimize the view shed? And apparently this individual, as he said he's been asked to look at other locations besides this that would determine its visual impact. So we want to see if those other impacts, what the visual impact was and what he did. It is highly, highly relevant. Whether they use best commercially reasonable efforts is a major issue in this hearing, perhaps the most important issue. And I proffer to the chairman, I don't expect to spend more than 5 minutes on this, but I think it's a very important 5 minutes.
And the confidentiality is with respect to what? The commercially sensitive information?
Yes. That's what they're saying.
Your Honor, just to correct something that counsel just said, the COP does not cover different site locations of the project itself. The COP covers, okay, well, just to clarify, the COP covers or includes simulations of different viewpoints of the project, but it does not address different sites for the project itself.
I didn't mention COP at all.
That's what Mr. Perkins was referring to.
Okay, all right. I was confused as to who mentioned the plan. Mr. Maloney, I do find that there is some relevance here. I'll allow you your 5 minutes to question the witness. We're gonna, at this point, go off the record. Mr. Executive Secretary, if we could do what we need to do at this point to remove people from the room and cut the live feed.